Hi there, my name is Kathy Manry, and today is February the 9th, 2009. We're here at Warner University today to discuss the history of Lake Wales. I'm here with Frank Hunt, whose family was one of the earliest families to come to Lake Wales, and this project is a project of the Lake Wales Library and the City of Lake Wales Oral History Project. I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Frank Hunt and to get to know a little about Lake Wales. He is the treasure trove of knowledge. Frank came to Lake Wales in 1879. Just kidding. Frank, what did happen in 1879?
That's when this area was first surveyed there, and it was about this same time that Chief Tallahassee and his Seminoles left the area. And in fact, one of them was one called Billy Bowlegs, who built a ditch, or they call it Billy's Dreen, across the Camp Mack Road, just right off the Great Masterpiece Road. That when we had a grove out there, they'd always refer to it as Billy's Dreen, and that it's still there, but now it's been paved over since in recent years, so you don't notice that ditch. But it was
Really?
It was made by Billy Bowlegs.
Fascinating. Early Seminole history.
That's right.
Yeah.
But then after that, I think it was 1902, so Mr. G.V. Tillman came to the area and saw the beauty of the area and convinced the Sessoms Investment Company to buy something like 5,000 acres in this area around Lake Wales and Crystal Lake, that area. And then subsequent to that, he and Mr. Tillman, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Stewart, and Mr. Bullard formed the Lake Wales Land Company to really organize Lake Wales.
And they lived in Bartow.
Yes, at that time. The thing that really gave them the impetus to go ahead, the railroad came south from Haines City in 1911, and that opened up this area for development. Until then, this sandy soil along the ridge just made it almost impossible for any travel, and there were no navigable streams there. As a result, there was just nothing going on here except a few cattlemen would drive cattle back and forth from the Kissimmee River Valley to the Peace River Valley, but there wasn't anything else here. But when the railroad came through, then these men saw the opportunities to develop the area and formed the land company and built what later became the Plantation Inn, built the old Hotel Wales right across from the railroad track to house people they brought into the area.
How big was the original hotel?
I don't know how many rooms, but it was quite sizable. In fact, for years, any big events were held there. They would have dances there. The first church services in Lake Wales were held in this building. When my wife and I were married, our wedding reception was there in that building. It was quite a large two-story wooden building, but it spread out over a good distance.
Because in looking at Mrs. Wetmore's diary, as we call one of our early histories, it seemed that there could be a lot of people staying there at once.
Yes, it was quite a nice size. It was just, but I couldn't really tell you how many rooms they had, but it was quite nice size.
It has wonderful memories for me. Even I was sorry that it was burned in the 70s.
Yeah.
When the railroad was put in, it went from Haines City through West Lake Wales?
No, it came through Lake Wales. Right, it's the one that's there right now, the ACL tracks. And the intention was for the ACL, Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, to build a road on south to Miami. But what happened, Flagler went down the East Coast and reached the Miami area first, and of course Plant went down from Jacksonville across to Tampa. And so the Seaboard decided to also build one south, and they got their tracks through West Lake Wales first and reached the lower East Coast. So the coastline never finished. It went down, I think, below Lake Placid, maybe Palmdale, something like that, but it never went across.
And that's the one that comes down through Lake Wales?
Yes, yes. And in the early days, turpentine and timber was the big industry in the area, and it just trainload after trainload of lumber and logs would come up that track through Lake Wales. In fact, I can remember, of course, in the days before air-conditioned buildings were open, and frequently in church services, or if you had anything going on in the high school, when the trains went by, you just stopped because you couldn't hear.
It was like that even when I was in school. Yeah. You mentioned timber. Did we have much timber?
Oh yes.
Production
in fact,
here?
Say Turpentine probably was the first business. I think Mr. Johnson formed the Turpentine company there on the northeast corner of Lake Wales Lake. But then timber and lumber was the next big business. In fact, for years, Townsend Sash Store and Lumber Company was the biggest business in town, and they had plants in Sebring and Bartow and Haines City, all up and down the ridge. But the one here was the big one for cutting and lumber and furnishing materials for everybody up and down the whole
Just
ridge.
the native pine?
Yes, primarily pine.
And Robert Lassiter told me when the Grove House was opened that when the people first came to Lake Wales, the pines were huge. I have no recollection, obviously, I have no recollection of that. But
Kathy, they were. I mean, I'm talking about, you know,
That's
like
what he
this.
said.
In fact, when we built our house there on the lake, right on the north side of Sunset Drive, there were still some of the virgin pines there that had the slash where they'd cut them for turpentine.
Really?
And those trees were still there until after the recent hurricanes. The recent hurricanes either killed some of them or the beetles came in. They're dead now and they're gone. But it was quite easy to see the turpentine slash on a lot of these trees up until relatively recently.
When did the turpentine business stop?
I don't know. Probably up till about the time of in the Depression, but I really don't know.
Do you have any recollection of it?
No, not in Lake Wales area. I'm aware of the turpentine business. In fact, my mother's family was from the Gainesville area, and there was quite a big turpentine industry up there. And I remember seeing those in the pots they attached to the bottom of the trees and made the cut to get the turpentine out. But I don't really remember anything in Lake Wales.
And in Lake Wales, where were the groves planted? All over what is now part of our town?
Some, but not too much. Mostly on the hills, because the town was laid out there when it was still primarily the pines and the palmettos and the native woods. And then a lot of the citrus was planted after they cut it for the timber. Then it opened it up for citrus. Plus, once the railroad came through, then it gave a way to get the citrus shipped out. So most of the citrus in this area were planted in the teens and early to mid-20s. Well, as a result, the town was already laid out at that time. And so there were some groves up in what we call now town, but the only ones that I'm really too familiar with were up on Burns Avenue or on the west side of town, but not much in the downtown area. There were some, however.
Very interesting.
Where the housing development is there, right south of the Seminole Hotel, and there was big groves in that area.
I believe you told me a story at one point about, didn't you use mules to take care of?
Oh yeah, but again, because the soil was so sandy that the trucks of that day, that was long before four-wheel drive, that the trucks just weren't able to haul any of the equipment in or out, particularly loaded trucks with fruit. So we had, our company had at one time I think 46, 48 head of mules, and used that to not only take the workers out to the groves, but also to haul the fruit in, or the equipment that needed to be in the groves.
Was Hunt Brothers built at early on where Hunt Brothers is today?
Essentially so. My dad first came to Lake Wales during the spring break of 1920. He was a student at the University of Florida, and he came down here then. My uncle was already here working for the state citrus plant board. And in fact, when my dad first came to Lake Wales, the old T.J. Parker house, which was built on the northeast corner, northwest corner of there, Park Avenue and Scenic Highway. That building was being moved down to next to the playground, and was sitting on the railroad track at the time he first came to town. It later became the guest house and was there, it was torn down I think in the 60s, but it was there for many years. But anyhow, citrus was getting started at that time, and I forget now what the first question was you asked me.
About the mules, using
the mules. Yeah, and so it was, our mule lot was where the Passion Play was until relatively recently, and we called that Hunt Brothers Camp, and we had housing for employees that lived around that, and we had barns and hayloft and that type thing, and had a clay pit there. We hauled clay from there to put on a lot of the roads in and around.
I was going to ask you if that was a borrow pit.
Yes, and now the sinkhole itself wasn't, but the clay pit was right to the east side of that property where the Passion Play was. But on weekends, frequently we'd take wagons and come to town and to take employees there that lived in Lake Wales, and we had a feed store and warehouse next to what was Townsend Lumber Company. They're right off of what is now Wiltshire Boulevard and Lincoln Avenue. But several times when the mules had been locked up there over the weekend, as kids will do, they'd open the gates and let the mules out. I can remember several times being called by the police there on Saturday or Sunday, and we'd have to get up and go around trying to round up mules that were going through downtown Lake Wales.
Good old stories of Lake Wales.
That's right.
In downtown Lake Wales.
Right.
Well, actually, I remember even in the 60s or the 50s, Lake Wales was a lot more rural then, because my dad used to bring in farm animals onto Lake Wales Lake and put them in the back of the house just overnight, that kind of thing. So things have changed a lot since then.
Good bit.
One of the things that I was fascinated in reading your paper about Lake Wales was the attitude that people had in what you referred to as not having a town and gown mentality, so that we have always cared.
That, to me, that's one of the things that people don't realize, the influence the original founders had in the way Lake Wales grew and developed. From the very first, land was set aside for playgrounds and parks and churches, schools. You take all the land from, immediately east of the downtown area, right between Park Avenue and Sessoms Avenue, virtually to Lake Wales Lake, was set aside to be playground and parks, and then the big area around the lake was set aside. Obviously, a lot of that lakefront property would have sold for pretty high prices for residential lots if they'd chosen to do that, but they set that aside to be parks.
It's spectacular. And the original founding fathers had that in mind.
Yes. In fact, say Mr. E.C. Stewart from Bartow was one of them, and he was really instrumental in the first church, which was the Presbyterian Church there on the corner of Park Avenue and 3rd Street. He visioned that church being built at the head of Stewart Avenue because he was a Presbyterian or ARP from Bartow and thought that would be a good location. Well, looking right straight down a busy street, right at a railroad track that had a lot of traffic, didn't particularly appeal to the local people, so they prevailed upon Mr. Stewart to give them the corner lot there where the church is today, or where the original church was, and it's still part of the church campus. But it was just one example. And then Mr. Johnson was very influential in getting the first lands set aside for the school, which is today we refer to that as the first permanent building as the 1919 school building. Actually, 1919 was the end of the first school year. The building, according to the records I've seen, was actually completed in September of 1918 for the 18-19 school year.
And what grades would have been in that school?
At that time, it was grades 1 through 10.
And that's as far as you
and that's
could
as far
go.
as they went at that time. But very quickly it changed because 1926, the old high school building immediately east of this building was built, and it had grades through 12. In fact, there were 6 graduates on Lake Wales High School, the first class.
In 1926?
Well, no, they graduated.
Oh, you mean in the 1919?
For the 1919 building. They graduated in let me see, 1922, I think. But say the schools the land was set aside and given by the land company. This location for the Presbyterian Church, and I understand the location for several of the other churches. I'm not certain, but I think perhaps the Methodist Church and Baptist Church both. But I'm not sure of that. But I know that the land was given by the founders for.
Well, that's interesting, because I've often wondered how old those church locations are. I know that the Art Center, the Catholic Church, was built in 1928, so I know what the time was for that church.
Well, I think the location of the First Baptist Church property is there at the corner of, what's that, 4th Street and Central Avenue.
Right.
And the original Methodist Church location was where the Christian church has been up right next to Johnson Funeral Home there on Sesame Avenue.
Right. Well, the church, the Holy Spirit Church, was really built out of town, very far out of town.
Yes,
then.
That's
in 1928,
right.
that would have been
part of that. Mr. Yarnell was very, very instrumental in that church, and he was developing Highland Park at the time, and was quite a promoter, quite a personality, quite a developer. And in fact, he hired my dad and my uncle to plant a great many of the groves from Highland Park north to Highway 60 there. And of course, the Holy Spirit Church was overlooking that location, and I think he envisioned Highland Park growing up that way. In fact, a good many of those groves at one time were in the city limits of Highland Park, not Lake Wales. I'm not certain where the line was, but he was quite a visionary as to what was going to develop.
So would you say that Mr. Yarnell was the developer for Highland Park?
Oh yes, very much so.
And was he still alive when you?
Oh no, he died in the 30s. But he built Casa de Josefina, and really it was one of the show places of all of Central Florida, and had many big social events there. And he would have very, very prominent people from around the state come and be there for the events he had.
But it was a private home.
But it was private home. He was quite a promoter. His widow lived to quite an old age and used to come by our packet house after I was down there, and so I knew her, but I never knew him. And
how did the Bonnier Lodge come to be?
Kathy, I'm not sure. It was called Lake Pierce Clubhouse, but again, it was built back in the 20s. There were several of them. That was built on Lake Pierce, and there was another clubhouse built on the south side of Lake Pierce that burned some years ago, and of course what is now a Noah's Ark there in Ridge Manor was built again as casino clubhouse. I'm not sure just what the background, but again those were part of the built back in the 20s.
It was really a boom.
Yeah, it was very much so. In fact, you read the early records of the dollars worth of building permits that were
millions.
Well, I think 1925, 26 each, well over $1 million of building permits in this area.
I'd be interested to know what that would be in today's dollars.
Oh, in today's dollars, it'd be way up there. And it was this spirit that really led the people in Lake Wales to build the Walesville Hotel, or what is called the Grand Hotel now, which was a community project. The money was all raised locally. In fact, they sold certificates. I know my dad had stock in the Lake Wales Hotel Association, whatever it was called. Mr. Laster did. A number of people bought stock in that association. Now, none of them ever made any money. In fact, the hotel, by the time it was completed, the Florida land boom had burst, and the hotel really just had financial problems all through the years. It changed hands several times, but I doubt if anybody ever made any money off of it.
Really? It was never really a huge commercial success?
No, never a commercial success, and not even huge, certainly not, but I don't think it would even made money for anybody. But it was a a top quality building when it was built. And one of the things, see, we had a severe hurricane go through here in 1926 and again in 28. Well, that was the time period in which this hotel was being built. So it was built to withstand hurricane winds, and as a result, I've been told it would be very difficult to tear down because it's got such substantial structure.
I have toured it recently, and I would agree. It looks like it would be almost impossible to tear down. The interior walls look like exterior walls. They're
right.
very, very solid.
Yeah.
So I think it's there for the
That's
duration.
right.
And hopefully we're going to see it come back.
Well, I hope so, because it's certainly been a landmark in Lake Wales.
Maybe it will have its huge heyday in the future. We can hope for that. Tell me about the schools in the beginning. The little schoolhouse was built.
All right,
when was that built?
1931, I think. The one that's there now, there at the top of the hill, was built and housed all the grades they had at that time, grades 1 through 10. And it was completed, I think, in the early fall of 1918. We call it the 1919 building, but it was because of the 1918-19 years, as I said. Then the high school building immediately east of it was built in, or finished there in 26. And then the little building down at the foot of the hill was built in 31, I believe, or 32. And it was built to house the primary grades. In fact, that's where I went to school. It had grades 1 through 3 there, but very quickly the town outgrew that. And by the time I was in the second grade, I was up in what is called the 1919 building now. But those 3 buildings housed all the Lakeville school children until 1939, I think it was.
Polk Avenue?
And then Polk Avenue was built at that time.
Well, every time you've listed the populations of school children, it's been stunning to see how fast.
I say it's hard to realize how fast the town was growing at that time. I don't remember the exact numbers now, but it was.
I've been sort of surprised that none of the Stewarts ever lived in Lake Wales.
No, they were from Bartow and very, very active in Bartow. Now, Mr. Stewart's daughter, Ms. Dunn, owned the property immediately east of the Presbyterian Church, and Mr. Stewart built the house that's now called the Stewart Dunn Oliver House for Ms. Dunn. It was originally on the northeast corner of that intersection. Now it's on the southwest corner of that intersection. But none of the Stewart family ever lived here, other than Ms. Dunn did live here.
And probably went to the First Presbyterian Church.
I reckon so. I never knew her, so I don't know.
Mr. Parker's store, the original store then, didn't stay at the northwest corner of Scenic and Park?
No, it was being moved in 1920
That's
there.
amazing.
And the reason I remember that's my dad said that was one of the things that struck him more than anything else in his early memories of Lake Wales, because you don't normally see a great big 2-story wooden building sitting on a railroad track.
Well, you don't usually see it doing anything at this point. And then did T.J. Parker open another store?
I don't know. He would have been. I say I never knew him, so I don't know whatever happened to him.
So when you were growing up, there was no Parkers?
No. Both those 2 blocks of Stewart and Park Avenue were pretty well developed there during the 20s, and there was very little bit of additional construction after that, but not much. But my lands, we had. When I was growing up, we had 3 drugstores in downtown Lake Wales, 2 of them with curb service. You had 4 grocery stores, again, and our meat markets, and 2 of them made home deliveries for you. We had.
When was this?
During the 30s. All this was before World War II.
Really?
And there was quite an extensive downtown area. In fact, I've been told that people all up and down the ridge thought the shopping was better in Lake Wales than anywhere this side of Tampa at that time, and that we had such a concentration of nice shops and stores right in the downtown area.
And when did Charlie Jenkins open a Publix here?
So the store in Lake Wales was the second store that they had. I'm not certain, Kathy, the date. It would have been in the mid-30s, early. I don't know. I know it was early on.
Do you know where the original store was?
The first one I remember was about where the Wachovia Bank is now.
So on Stewart.
On Stewart Avenue. There's something about the, I don't remember the other location, but actually Charlie, of course, was George Jenkins' brother, and so George was the original founder of the Publix, but Charlie was with him, I presume, when they started. But Charlie himself owned the store in Lake Wales. It was not part of the Publix chain originally, and he ran it. I mean, he was the manager, and long after they built the second store up there where the Bank of America is today. But I can remember him being in both of those stores.
I think I remember when the Bank of America, I remember going to that store.
Yeah.
And I remember it seemed very revolutionary at the time. There were automatic doors and things like that were just stunning at the time. And I think Charlie was still running it when we moved here in the 50s.
Yeah. And interesting that most of the time, for the customers of the store, he was near the front door and spoke to you as you came in, and always had a big smile and just greeted you. Certainly as a manager, he had to be in other areas of the store a lot of times, but he somehow, from my memory, he always arranged to be near the front door, would speak to you came in, and of course he had a phenomenal memory, and most people were called by name as they came in the store.
My mother would say that it said that he walked her to her car one day with her groceries, and he told her, she said something about the price of produce. And he said, well, the one thing I know, Ms. Kay, I'm sure he called her Kay, he said, the one thing I know is that pole beans have to be 16 cents a pound. He said, the thing in Lake Wales that women will not put up with is for pole beans to cost more than 16 cents a pound. Well, I think they're now a little more than 16 cents a pound. Well, I say there are several
things. That reminds me of a story, tells you how far back I go, but one time at my house, we were getting ready to have a hamburger cookout, and I asked my wife, I said, Margaret, where's the ketchup? She said, oh, we don't have any ketchup right now. I said, you don't have any ketchup? She said, no, I couldn't find anything that cost less than 21 cents a bottle, and I wasn't going. So we had our hamburgers without ketchup that night because she wouldn't pay 21 cents a bottle.
I'm sure she's going to love to hear that you told that story. I find that charming story. And when your father came to be with his brother and start Hunt Brothers, it wasn't started as a Grove business, but really as a caretaking business?
Yes. Well, caretaking citrus groves. They would care for other people and plant the groves, as I said, for Mr. Yarnell, but very early on started planting groves for themselves, and it just grew from that. And we built our packing house. So the company was started in 1922, and then we built our packing house in 1928 on the current location where it is today. Of course, it's much larger today. One interesting thing, the packing house was completed in August of 1928, and then we had a major hurricane Labor Day of that year, and it blew the roof of the packing house off over onto the Highland Park golf course before they ever operated the first box of fruit through the house.
Oh, goodness. And what was the devastation like for those two hurricanes versus what we had in 2004?
Of course, I wasn't there. I don't remember all of that.
But you've heard stories.
I have. I think they probably, in one way, it wasn't as much because, of course, the town wasn't as developed. On the other side, though, it was more destructive because we didn't have the infrastructure, and it took quite a while for the town to recover. And unfortunately, the land boom that had been going on since the late teens and all through the early 20s was just before ending there in 1926, and then that hurricane combined with the 28 one finished it. Most people think about the 28, 29 stock market crash in the 30s, but actually Florida's boom had already pretty well burst by 1927, 28.
Really? Because it was based so much on land?
Yes. You know, in some ways, Kathy, I'm not so sure. It isn't a little bit like what we've gone through in recent years. You know, we had quite a housing boom, quite just a fantastic growth occurring up and down the ridge and really all over Florida there in the late 90s and early 2000, and it really didn't end about 2006, something 2007. Well, the land values back in the 20s were spiking, and the construction was going on at a pace that really had not been equal until relatively recently.
I wonder if there's a lesson to be learned from that.
I think so. If a bubble grows too fast, it's going to have to break at some point because things get overpriced.
Yeah, bubbles are not stable.
That's right.
Yeah, they definitely burst. Was Grove caretaking early on as scientific as it is now? Were they breeding special varieties?
They did. In fact, through this area, because of the sand hills, the primary rootstock was what's called a rough lemon rootstock, and the reason they selected the rough lemon, among others, is the roots pretty well went to China. It was a very extensive root system, went very deep, and this sandy soil, then it enabled them to sustain the real dry periods we had. Of course, in early days, there wasn't anywhere near the sophisticated irrigation systems, and as a result, they wanted rootstock that would be able to withstand droughts. But again, the university's School of Horticulture, School of Agriculture, from the very earliest there was helping to develop the citrus industry in Florida.
One of my favorite stories that you've told is the stories of what it was like firing the groves back when my brother was growing up. Nowadays, you sprinkle or spray.
Of course, going way back, they used wood, they used old tires and that type of thing to build fires in the grove to protect the trees and the fruit. And then they began to use what they call smudge pots. The ones we had were primarily 9-gallon smudge pots that used diesel fuel, just open flame. Well, then as time went on, to get better utilization out of the fuel, they had stack heaters with cones on the top, and then eventually had return stack trying to cut down some on the emissions. But really, way up into the 50s and 60s, that was the primary thing used to protect the groves in the winter when we had a freeze. I can remember seeing smudge pots burning there when I was in junior high school. We'd go out and help, and it just as far as you could see south of 60 down to Highland Park, and also west of town, and really the Mammoth Grove area were just fire pots everywhere. And the smoke would be so thick you couldn't see in a distance at all. But it did protect the groves and give you 6, 8, 10 degrees warmer temperature on a still night.
Did you know, I'm sure you did know at that time, how long the citrus had to be frozen, or how long?
Yes. The rule of thumb, of course, it depends on the time of year and a lot of other factors, but basically oranges will stand temperatures until it gets 28 for 4 hours. Anything above 28, oranges generally will fare fairly well, but the lower it gets below 28, the quicker it'll freeze, and the rule of thumb say 28 for 4 hours, 26 for 2 hours, and if it starts getting into the low 20s, then the trees are hurt and the wood is hurt. That's what happened to us back all during the 80s. We had several major freezes there, one in Christmas of 83 and one Christmas of 89 particularly. The temperatures went down into the teens and stayed there long enough that a lot of the trees were killed. I know for our company about 65% of our trees were killed there in 1989. but it does depend on the time of year. The thing that really can be more devastating if you have an early freeze, say a December or early January, then have some warm weather, the tree will try to come out again, and so if it does, that new growth and getting the sap up in the tree again makes it very vulnerable if you have a second freeze. And that's what happened to Florida in general. The great 1895-96 freeze, we had one in the end of December, and then we had another one the first part of February. Well, in the meantime, it had been warm. Well, those trees were killed, and that's what wiped out virtually all the citrus from the Orlando area north up the St. Johns River.
And that's when frostproof got its name, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm trying to think of the beginning of the Presbyterian Church. That was really an epic event in Lake Wales because all of our founding fathers seemed to have a hand in it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things interesting about that, as I said, Mr. Stewart had the first church built. Now, the first church services in Lake Wales were in 1913, and then they organized a community church there. This first little white building that Mr. Stewart gave was completed in March of 1913 as a community church. But because he was Presbyterian, he got, or an associate Reformed Presbyterian, he got minister from Bartow to come over and preach for them every Sunday afternoon. Well, the story Ms. Wetmore told is that with the first services in the church, that the varnish on the pews hadn't really completely dried, and so the people stuck to the pews. And then on top of that, the church was built up off the ground, and so hogs would roam the area, and they had been staying under the church where there were fleas there, and so the people in the church got eaten up with fleas. In fact, she recorded that after the church service, she went to speak to the minister as he stood at the door, and she had 4 fleas crawling on his collar. And then she speculates she didn't know where else they were in his clothes. But it was just interesting. But then the church reorganized as a Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church in 1914, and say it was recognized as the first established and chartered church in Lake Wales.
Were these, in Ms. Wetmore's diary, they call it, she talks about the hogs, and were they wild hogs?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And they roamed everywhere?
Well, that's right. Of course, town itself, you had open range all across Florida. In fact, my dad was on the what's called city council at that time in the early 1930s, and the town decided they wanted to stop cattle and livestock from roaming through the town, and he said that he got a letter from one woman that if she couldn't have her cow in town anymore, she would just have to move out because she couldn't feed her babies. And Daddy said if when he started taking the milk from babies, it was time to get out of politics. But no, it wasn't unusual at all for people in town to have chickens or a cow or keep a horse and that type thing. Now, the heart of town, no, but they were very lax as to what you could have.
Well, the fleas apparently, because of the hogs, were a terrible problem.
That's right.
I think they were even at the Hotel Wales, the eventual later.
I don't remember.
I think so. Tina tells that there's someone told her a story about how people would put a white sheet down so that they could see where the fleas were, and they'd collect the fleas and I guess and take them out and take them outside. Those were some odd times. Bach Tower just celebrated its 80th birthday, and that really calls to mind an awful lot of the early history of Lake Wales and Edward Bach coming.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about how the Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. came and what he did as far as Lake Wales was concerned?
All right. Well, let me back up a little bit. Mr. Ruth there was a man whose family owned a lot of the land in what is now Mountain Lake, and he came down here and saw that land, and was trying to figure out what to do. And the Lake Wales land company was being developed at the time. Well, he went back to the north. In fact, I think he was in New York City, and began to hear what was going on. So he came down and he helped establish what we now call Mountain Lake Estates. In fact, I think he was the first president of Mountain Lake Estates. And I think Mr. Tillman and maybe some of the others from the land company were also officers there. And when they formed Mountain Lake, the south boundary of Mountain Lake and the north boundary of Lake Wales are the same. And so there was quite a overlap of interest there. And by the time the residential area about Mountain Lake started being developed, Mr. Bach was one of the early developer that built a house there in Mountain Lake, and determined to develop a sanctuary garden there on top of the hill, what we now call Bach Tower Gardens. Well, he hired Mr. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to do the landscaping from there, but because of his interest in Lake Wales and the overlapping associations they had, Mr. Bach also got Mr. Olmsted to lay out a plan for the a good bit of the residential area of Lake Wales, and Mr. Bach paid for something like half of the cost of those plantings. They planted magnolias along Lakeshore Boulevard. They had palm trees. They had Mount Ebony trees. They had bottle brush, different types of palms lined up Central Avenue, Park Avenue, Johnson, Tillman, Bullard, all the way across all those streets there from the lake west. A lot of them went all the way over to I think First Street, maybe gone beyond, but I know they went went west of the Scenic Highway with that avenue planting.
So he had nothing to do with the planning of the street system itself, but just the landscape.
That's right. No, the land company laid out the streets there. In fact, those streets there were named after the early founders, Mr. Bullard, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Tillman, Mr. Stewart, and then Sessoms Avenue is the one that runs beside the Methodist Church. Mr. Sessoms was head of the Sessoms Investment Company that had the original 5,000 acres. Interesting enough, they hired a man named Carlton Neidiger to be the surveyor for the area. Well, Neidiger is a name that they felt like probably wouldn't go well on the street, so Carlton Avenue is named because his first name is Carlton rather than last name.
Well, then, when he surveyed that Carlton Avenue being south of Lake Wales Lake, seems like that would be pretty far out.
They laid the streets really from 11th Street that runs by the hospital, everything west of that all the way, and really on both sides of what is now the Highway 60, Cohasset Avenue, were all part of the original town laid out. Now, once you got to 11th Street, the only thing east of that was the Lakeshore Boulevard itself that went around the lake. There was nothing laid out there in the original plot. Now, what is now the land across from the hospital, Druid Circle, and that was a development that started there in the boom, but went bust there and was never developed. But the original town was from 11th Street back to what would be now Wetmore, and then was Walker Street. Now it's Martin Luther King Boulevard. But all those streets from there down to Lakeshore Boulevard and around the south side of the lake were the original layout.
And was it the original plan that you could come in and purchase 10 acres, but you had a certain amount of time during which you had to build, didn't you?
Yes. Now, I think in selling people a lot in Highland Park, he wanted to buy a 10-acre grove and a lot in Highland Park. And Lake Wales, they sold lots. I don't think they tied. I don't think they tied it to groves, but they required you to build a house in a certain period of time because they it wasn't just to be land speculation. They were wanting to develop the town, so they required people to build a house on the lots they bought within a period of time.
I wonder what the dates are on those early plats.
Kathy, I don't know. Several of those houses there, right around the west side of Lake Wells Lake, along Lakeshore Boulevard, were some of the early houses that were built. They're still standing now. The oldest residential house in Lake Wales was the house there on the southwest corner of Park Avenue and 3rd Street, right across the Presbyterian Church. Is now a parking lot. That was down many years ago, but there are several of those houses right along Lakeshore Boulevard that date back into the early teens.
Well, the All home.
Yes, that house, and the house there that was Mr. Mack's house there, across from the football field, and then the corner of Park Avenue and Lakeshore was across the Briggs house. Mr. Briggs was one of the early developer, and he built that house. And there's a 2-story place where John Caldwell lived on south of that, and then you come on down to the corner of Central and Lakeshore. There's a 2-story place there that was one of there. So several of those right along there were early houses. Now, one of the interesting houses is the house that's now the Presbyterian Church Manse, where the Rocknesses lived. Mr. W.J. Craig built that in the early days. Mr. Craig was an executive with the Pullman Railroad Company, and he'd come to Lake Wells in the winter, had that as the winter home, and he would bring his private rail car and park it there, bring him down to Lake Wells. And then later, when he retired, he lived there until he died. But he was one of the early people in Lake Wales there in the 20s.
Are they the Craigs that?
Yes.
Is the Roy Craig family?
Yes. Mr. W.J. Craig was the father of Mr. Roy Craig Sr.
Wow. And the Women's Club, where the Women's Club is now, is that an old building as well?
No, the Women's Club building was built in the 30s. I think it was with WPA money, but I'm not sure that was called Washington Park. The Women's Club, where the Women's Club is and where the library is, Washington Park. And in the early days, the May Day celebration was held there each year when they elected the May Queen, and the little Chamber of Commerce building, which was later Chamber of Commerce building, sat on one corner of that property also, and was the first building on that property. But again, the Women's Club building would go back into the mid-30s, I think.
That piece of property where the Women's Club building is and the library is was privately owned, because that was Tillman. Isn't the library on property that did belong to Mr. Tillman? It
was part of the Lake Wales Land Company property. The Lake Wales Land Company gave that. That's part of the property that was set aside. Now, when Mr. Tillman, whether he owned it individually, but my understanding that he was president of Lake Wales, or I'm not sure what his office was, but anyhow, he and Mr. Stewart, Mr. Tillman, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Bullard formed the Lake Wales Land Company. And my understanding is that Washington Park was part of the original property laid out, but I'm not certain whether he owned it personally.
And the entire circumference of Crystal Lake must be city park.
That's right.
And the park itself, how old is the play park?
Well, again, that was all filled in. There was a marshy area between Crystal Lake and Lake Wales Lake, and all the way around Lake Wales Lake and over to North Lake Wales. And in the 20s, the city, the land company, had all that pumped in to make the what is now the playground area, and also the park area around Lake Wales Lake, and the what is now Legion Field and the athletic area was all pumped in also by the land company. When
you say pumped in, do you mean hauled in, or do you mean?
No, they pumped it out of the lake.
Out of the lake?
They pumped it out of the lake.
Really?
That's why the north and west side of Lake Wales Lake it's fairly deep when we have decent rainfalls,
Right.
because the sand was dredged out of the lake there on the north and west side to fill in all that shoreline.
So all of that area is sand.
Yes.
It's
yeah.
essentially
Yeah.
all sand.
And a lot of it just kept settling for years. When one of the things, among others, about the old pavilion was there that by having been built on pumped-in land and with muck underneath it, it just kept settling, and it would, the walls would crack, and they had problems. And in fact, the area around the football field had a track that went around it for when it was originally built. But it kept settling, and it was never too satisfactory, because they'd have to try to resurface to level it out. But in fact, you still see some low areas there in front of, across from the playground, where it settled some more.
Fascinating. So when was all of that done? In the teens?
Teens and early 20s, for my time.
Right. But I figured you might have read the book.
Yeah.
Well, you are a fascinating person to talk to, and I love the stories of Old Lake Wales, and I love the fact that you've seen the city hopefully stay with the idea that our goals are to have a good quality of life.
And I think it's carried through right to relative modern times, that the fact the community got behind bringing the Passion Play here, building the YMCA, supporting the library when it was built, and the Arts Center there. Different individuals really were the chief sponsors, but at the same time, the community rallied around them. The Care Center, and probably most recently, the new Edgewater Retirement Center. Absolutely,
absolutely. It's a community that really cares. At the dedication for Barney's Dream on Saturday.
Same type thing.
It's exactly the same, and the community will get behind something, and people in Lake Wales do know about it. Well, I thank you very much for sitting with me today and telling me about Lake Wales.
Well,
and I hope you're going to still be up for further updates going forward. We'll have others to talk to.
But as I told you earlier, just remember that history generally becomes what the historian says, and so I hope what I said is actually correct.
If it isn't correct, everyone in Lake Wales will forgive you, because the sentiment is still there. You're someone who loves Lake Wales.
From previous experience, I found out there will people will have differing memories, and so all of us don't remember exactly the same thing in the same way.
And as I pointed out early on, I don't believe you were here in 1879, even though I asked you questions back to 1879. But again, I thank you very much, and Lake Wales thanks you for everything you've done for Lake Wales.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you again.
Okay, thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.